Like me, you probably played guitar for some time before you became interested in learning jazz. And in a way, that should make it easier to learn since you can already play and you know a lot of things. But often, that experience can also be what gets in the way of learning. The advantage to learning jazz when you're already used to learning guitar is that you can easily recognize a lot of the skills that you need and you can come up with exercises to develop those skills. But that's actually also often where it starts to go wrong. One of the first times I encountered this was when I just figured out how valuable it was to be consistent, and especially being consistent with practicing technique. This was before I decided to pursue guitar as a profession, and I was just jamming with one of the bands that I was in next to studying mathematics and computer science at the university. Since I had started to practice scales and arpeggios daily, then that boosted my ability to improvise pretty massively. But of course, going from 0 to something is a huge difference. Starting to be able to find the notes on the neck and play the notes of the chord was giving me all these options, and pretty much everything sounded new and exciting, so this really seemed like the way to go. My goal in this was, of course, to get a better overview of the fretboard so that I knew where to find the arpeggios or the chords and how to play the scales that I wanted to use. And there is nothing wrong with that goal in itself. You do want to have an overview of all the arpeggios, scales, and so on. But what often happens is that it starts to overshadow learning to play. Well, I first want to learn all my scales and arpeggios all over the neck, and then I can get into improvising. Then you're probably setting yourself up to fail, simply because when it comes to learning jazz or any other kind of music for that matter, then knowing where the notes are doesn't mean that you magically know how to play the right melodies, use the right phrasing, or how to put those phrases together in a solo. If you think about it, then it's sort of obvious. Joe Pass would not be great in Van Halen, and Eddie Van Halen would probably not sound amazing doing chord melody arrangements. The way I tried to solve this was not the easiest way to go about it, and it's also not how I teach this, which I will get to. As I kept listening and trying to figure out some Parker stuff by ear, while mostly failing pretty badly, then I started to look for solos that were closer to sounding like Parker, but also easier to figure out. I ended up with some Ulf Orchenius solos, and finally Pat Martino's solo on Just Friends, which really helped a lot. I was also listening to Wes, but the stuff that I had was more of the commercial stuff, so it was mostly octaves and chords all the time. And in the late 90s, you were stuck with CDs and no internet, which in hindsight was actually a pretty limiting factor. Once I moved to Copenhagen, then I also started to have lessons with teachers who gave me a lot of vocabulary to learn, jazz licks and easy example solos to play, so that I started to get the language into my ears and also into my fingers. That made a huge difference and really helped me sound a lot better. In my opinion, it makes a lot more sense to have a more balanced approach to your practice so that you're not leaving behind important skills that you will need along the way. And it is not so that you have to learn all positions and variations in all keys of everything to play music. The recipe is not rocket science. Find an easy song where you need a few scales, learn the chords, learn the melody, figure out what the key is and a place to play all that stuff in the same area of the neck, and start playing music. If you can couple this with learning some vocabulary, then you're working on taking the things you practice to the place where you're actually making music with it. And you can always expand your fretboard knowledge along the way. In the end, you did not start exploring jazz to learn to play scales or find notes on the neck. And I can promise you that Wes and George Benson did not only practice scales. They probably spent a lot more time playing music and practicing songs. And you see the same type of problem with chords. But luckily, we have people like Ted Green who did get this. I can't start learning songs. I first need to learn all my drop 2 and drop 3 inversions. The idea that the more chord voicings you know, the better you are at comping is something that I come across very often online, and that is definitely not true. It's almost so that those two things have nothing to do with each other. Let me show you. When is comping good? It has to fit the music, so the right type of sound for the song and how the band is playing. Make the groove and the harmony clear, so you need to state where the time is and what the chord is as much as is needed in the way that you're playing the song. It needs to be a part of the music, so what you play should be a story. It should have dynamics, development, and make sense beyond being a robot playing a chord with some extensions. I mentioned Ted Green earlier in the video, and I think that is a good example of material that is trying to teach you not only some chords to play, but also how they fit together and become music, simply because he teaches the chords in the context of a progression. It's not just empty knowledge. The more I teach harmony and comping, then I also start to think that maybe it's very important to learn to understand chord symbols as options and think of a group of chord voicings instead of learning separate chords. And I doubt if Joe Pass spent most of his time learning inversions. I'm pretty sure he spent most of his time learning and playing songs. At one point I had some lessons with a guitarist who insisted that I also buy his books on chord voicings, which were in fact just books with all drop 2 chords, first major 7, then minor 7, then dominant 7th, and then the same for drop 3 and drop 2 and 4. The books didn't contain any examples of how this material could be used. It was just a lot of diagrams. I did practice that a bit, but as I was practicing, then it occurred to me that it was probably better just to make the inversions myself, because then they were easier to remember and I would know the chords a lot better. On guitar, it's fairly simple to make inversions along the neck for any chord. Let's take this C minor 7 chord. First, you find all the notes in the chord and then you order them in pitch. So C, G, B flat, E flat, and then we order those in pitch and you get C, E flat, G and B flat, which is of course just a C minor 7 arpeggio. Now you just look at the chord and see that C goes to E flat, G goes to B flat goes to C, and E flat goes to G. And then you have this voicing. And you can keep on moving each note in the chord and in that way create all the inversions that are on this string and do the same for other string sets. And essentially this works for any chord. But sometimes, of course, the inversions are not that playable. Again, I think you want to learn to comp on songs, so take an easy song and try to play the chords just using basic shell voicings. Pentatonic House is a really nice example of an easy song. From there you can develop your options by finding notes that work on top of the chord so that you can play melodies and create something that flows from chord to chord. Like this, you can start to develop your ability to improvise while also playing the chords, learn how to repeat rhythms and have melodies that really move across the progression. It's about turning chord symbols into music, not turning them into diagrams of chords. I don't really want to learn music theory, I just want to learn how to play jazz using only pentatonic scales. And there are two ways that this falls apart. The first one is a bit more subtle for beginners, but maybe the most important one, and that is that for most people, then the sound of jazz is not pentatonic. Even if I don't really like bebop scales, then I think it says a lot that they are created by adding notes to 7-note scales, not taking them away. See if you can hear it. A bebop phrase on an A minor 7 chord sounds like this. And an A minor 7 phrase using A minor pentatonic sounds like this. What you maybe can hear is that if you want to learn to play jazz, then you need to use the melodies and structures that are a part of that style, a part of the sound. Just like you don't try to learn to play blues using the chromatic scale and not learning the pentatonic scale. The other part of where this gets very difficult is that you need to be able to figure out which pentatonic scale to use over a chord. To do this, then you need to have a fairly good overview of what pentatonic scales are found in the scale that fits the chord, so you do need some theory. Let's say that you're improvising over a C major 7 sharp 11 and you want to use pentatonic scales. If you want to find a pentatonic scale that works, then you need to be able to find a scale that has the important chord tones, which would be E and B, the 3rd and the 7th of C major 7. And you probably also want to have the sharp 11 in there, the F sharp. Instead of just trying to construct something at random with those notes in there, then you can also look at the scale where the chord is found and what pentatonic scales are available in there. C major 7 sharp 11 is the 4 chord in G major. G major has 3 minor pentatonic scales, E minor, A minor and B minor. They all sort of work over C major 7, there are no strange notes in there, but there's only one of those scales that has an F sharp, and that's B minor pentatonic. And luckily that also has the E and the B, so we have sort of the core sound of the chord as well. So if you use theory the right way, then it really helps you to get an overview of how the notes and the chords fit together, which is something that can be incredibly useful. And the same goes for understanding the chords in the progression. And this also might seem very complicated, but it can be made a lot simpler. And if you check out this video, you can explore not only how I think about it, but also how Barry Harris and Pat Martino have their own approach.